Okay, good morning and good afternoon and possibly good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. This is Karen Morikis. I am the president of the Southern California chapter of ICEAA. And in lieu of doing in-person workshops this year, so far we've been doing some virtual webinars. So this is our summer virtual webinar entitled Bugs, Bugs, and More Bugs. And we always try to come up with a little catchy title to entice people to tune in and find out what this is all about. So I think if we go to the next slide, yes, this is our agenda. So we're going to do a little bit of introductory stuff, and then we'll get into the program. We have two speakers today, and we'll be introducing them as we get to that portion of the agenda. Then we will look at some of the results of the polling that we did in the spring and give you an opportunity to answer some additional questions. And if we have time, we can be doing some, I'll say back and forth chatting or even potentially talking. I don't know if everyone will have the capability to unmute themselves, but we'll see how that goes. All right, next. All right, so I said we had this catchy little title, Bugs, Bugs, and More Bugs. So we're going to have two presentations that have something to do with bugs, but bugs have, the word bugs has a different connotation or different definitions. And we are asking you, hey, can you identify 4 of them? And for the person who responds, yes, I can identify 4 of them, then we say, okay, what are those 4? So there are more than 4. Don't look in the dictionary. Just off the top of your head, can you identify 4 types of bugs? Type them into the window. There's actually more than 4. You'll type them into the chat window. Megan is the only one who will see them.
Oh, just a quick jump in, Karen. This is Megan. If everyone would make sure they're sending it to me. So when you type your chat, I believe it should say you should send it to a particular person. Or to the organizer. Yeah, anyway, give it a try. We'll see how it works.
Okay, and that way other people won't see what your answers are if you just send it to Megan. And the winner of the trivia question will receive a lovely coin from the Southern California chapter of ICEAA. And with that, you can take your time answering the question. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Layton, who is our chapter secretary. So I think we go, yes.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, I'm Nicole Layton. As Karen mentioned, I am the SoCal chapter secretary. I work at Technology Research here in the LA office. Just wanted to show again the 21-22 SoCal chapter board that was voted in at the beginning of this calendar year, leading with Karen as president, David as VP, Melissa, who's been on the board before, as treasurer, myself, Danny, who just jumped into the Region 7 position. And then we also have a handful of directors at large who have been very helpful. Lisa Colabella, Steve Sirk, Justin Knowles, Mike Pfeiffer, Darren Hoffman, and Hank Apgar. So feel free to reach out to any of us. And if you guys also want to support the board in any way, we'd love to have you. Next slide. And here's also a handful of volunteers that have been gracious enough to help us in what we've been trying to put together so far this calendar year. So we really appreciate all of the volunteer support. That's how I came onto the board before I was a member. And so we would love to increase this group if you guys would like to join.
And I would like to add one thing. The first picture there, Dara, he is the one who found us our second speaker today. Unfortunately, Dara is not able to attend, but I did want to give a shout out to him for inviting our second speaker.
Thanks, Karen. So we also wanted to just quickly go over our current events. In addition to putting together and hosting the event today, the group is also working on a training course, a design to cost training course led by David Bloom, our chapter VP. So we're putting that together, having a course development package. We would love any support or peer reviews if anyone is interested. It'll go through the 12-step GAO process and have other material in there as well. And then, as always, we're always kind of focused on the next workshop or webinar, whatever it may be. Our current plan is to have one later this fall. What that looks like, how long it will be, where it will be is TBD, depending on the current events. But if you guys have any ideas or what you would like to see or you would like to present, again, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll get a firm date out in the coming months of when that will be exactly. And, oh, no, one more. So as Karen mentioned, we'll have some polling at the end of this session. We did it at the end of our spring webinar, and we wanted to show some results. One of the questions of the polling was, what does ICEAA mean to you, or what do you think of when you hear the term ICEAA? And so we thought it was a fun thing to show, the word cloud that kind of came up based on all the responses from last webinar. I particularly like that, community is in here a good handful of times, whether we call ourselves cost estimators, analysts, whatever titles we may have. This is definitely a community for all of us. I will say the one that made me laugh the most was the one on the left-hand side, nerdy with love. I will agree with that one as well. But just a fun little response, and appreciate all of the interaction, and hope to see it again at the end of the session. And with that, I believe I'm handing it back over to Karen for the trivia status check.
Megan, has anyone answered our trivia question yet with 4 types of bugs?
We have got a pitiful 1 answer. So instead of using the chat box, it looks like the questions box is the way to do that, folks. So if you want to get your bug guesses in, that's the place to go.
All right, so we will revisit the trivia question later on. And with that, I think we're going into our program. Right, so Lisa Colabella is going to introduce our speaker, and Lisa is one of our directors at large or board members. So take it away, Lisa.
Great, thank you, Karen. Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Bryce Downing. Bryce is a quantitative research assistant at the RAND Corporation. His research interests include cyber policy, agent-based modeling, and administrative data science. And I also wanted to add that Bryce has a reputation for his high-quality work, his strong quantitative skill set, and his conscientiousness. Bryce holds a political science and economics degree from Case Western Reserve University, and before joining RAND, he was a modeling and simulation intern at the Army War College. His presentation today is not from a RAND project, but rather from his own independent research on the side. And now here is Bryce Downing talking about pricing software vulnerabilities.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Let me share my screen really quickly. Can everyone see the slide?
I can.
Okay, good. So I'm going to be talking today about pricing software vulnerabilities and bug bounties as a general concept, specifically in the public, private, and black markets. So let's just roll into this. So first off, we're sort of have to talk about what exactly we mean by a software vulnerability. So vulnerabilities are fundamentally different from exploits in that an exploit is sort of a finished product, right? A vulnerability is simply something that's wrong in your software or hardware that allows some nefarious actor to either execute some arbitrary code on your machine, to access data they shouldn't be able to access, or to gain privileges on your machine that they otherwise shouldn't be able to. So this is generally exploited to run some kind of payload, right? To access that data, to get root privileges, to be able to run certain things on your laptop or other local machine or server, to be able to access various network libraries that you have. And the final part of sort of a finished exploit is a distribution mechanism, right? Some way to propagate yourself. This is different than persistence, but you know, a way to actually distribute your vulnerability exploitation and payload to various machines. So this can either sort of be in software or hardware, right? I think most of the time we hear about software bugs, normally because there's a lot of software floating around. Different types of hardware are generally harder to identify, but there's lots of things that have been hardware bugs over the year. Certain Intel processors at various points in time. Famously, Stuxnet was a hardware exploit instead of a software exploit. And the general idea here is that exploits at the end of the day are about doing things with your machine that you might not want some other actor to do. And so why would you pay for these vulnerabilities? And so specifically, I'm talking about this first step in the chain. It might seem obvious why people might pay for exploits at the end. Generally, it's just to obtain information or to run some sort of various code on a computer. Those markets are sort of better understood because only really one type of person buys completed exploits, right? Unlike vulnerabilities, where you can see that these are purchased by a variety of different people for a variety of different reasons, and one of these might be to develop exploits, right? So once vulnerabilities are discovered, you as a nefarious actor might choose to purchase these vulnerabilities to develop your own exploit to obtain data or to execute nefarious code or various other sorts of things. You could be patching your own software to remove that vulnerability, right? This is your sort of traditional bug bounty program where various tech companies or government entities might purchase these vulnerabilities from security researchers to enable them to go and fix them, right? And finally, it's to resell, right? There's plenty of people in this market who make their entire living buying and reselling these vulnerabilities, mostly on the to public and private entities, but occasionally this is also done in sort of black markets. But generally, this market is pretty opaque. It's relatively difficult to actually understand who you should be selling things to, how to go about doing so. And so many of these times there's sort of a middleman in here where they might identify specifically how much this is worth, who they might be selling it to. But needless to say, there are plenty of people who aren't securities researchers or exploit developers who are buying these things and then reselling them. So let's talk a little bit about pricing in the private sector, right? So most of the time you have people who are reselling things, right? As I said earlier, there's sort of this relatively hard to decipher market. It's difficult to actually determine the value of exploits at various points in time or to go about selling them. The verification process is also very difficult for a lot of people, right? There's certainly this idea that companies might not trust random entities out in the aether trying to tell them that there's something wrong with their software, but it might come slightly easier and with slightly less intensive scrutiny if it comes from a sort of well-known middleman sellers or broader bug bounty programs that are run by sort of third parties. And obviously, eventually they have to sell it to someone in the private sector who's going to be patching these vulnerabilities to prevent theft of company. But so the idea here is that there's sort of two types of vulnerabilities that most private sector actors are looking to prevent by fixing these vulnerabilities. And one of these is to prevent the theft of company resources, and the other one is to prevent liability in case of the theft of customer resources. And this is sort of where we hit one of our first sort of interesting departures from what we normally think of in this market, whereas there isn't an exceptionally large legal history of how exactly liability is assigned for theft of customer resources. Right, this is a field that the legal profession has really only gotten into over the last 20 to 30 years, and it really hasn't even reached really high levels of prominence up until the last 10 to 15. So it's likely that we're going to see a lot of new law made in this area, but more importantly, for the time being, it becomes hard to price in that sort of thing, which is important because the big analog here for buying bugs in the private sector is it acts kind of as a form of insurance, right? You know, it's unfortunately, unlike insurance, there aren't really actuarial tables that tell you how likely bugs are, that you don't know if they exist or not, to be discovered, and how conducive those bugs are to actually being exploited to create exploits. You know, so we're operating in sort of a realm of high levels of uncertainty here. We need to make decisions about how to price these sorts of things in, which is, you know, as you'll see in a moment, a difficult task. But yeah, so there's some complicating factors here. You know, there's a lack of legal precedent surrounding the standards of care for a lot of these things. You know, well, one thing that gets brought up is in Europe, GDPR, where despite the fact that it's a relatively robust protection on customer data and has a lot of sort of cybersecurity requirements for a variety of things, whether or not many judges or juries are one, capable of understanding exactly what's going on, and two, whether or not the law is actually particularly clear on what sort of standards are to be applied is difficult to determine, and hasn't entirely been worked out in court yet. But more importantly, there's this sort of additional side where, you know, especially for customer data, you wind up with this question of, well, certainly there are costs to not storing as much customer data as we would like, but maybe it shields us from certain different kinds of liability. But that's sort of a substitute good for good cybersecurity, or something. You could think of it similarly to that, right? There's a different cost being paid, there's a different method to sort of insulating customer data, but it achieves to a certain extent a similar effect. So here's what your average Google bug bounties look like for sort of Google web sources. So these are ordered basically in terms of, up top is sort of the most severe thing, remote code execution. You know, if you're able to arbitrarily and remotely execute code on someone else's computer through Chrome, you know, that's a pretty serious vulnerability. You know, if that enables you to sort of take over someone's Google account, which might include their email, you know, various things connected to that, including banking and various types of Google services, you know, you can get paid up to around $30,000 for discovering a vulnerability and sending it to Google to make sure that they can patch it, right? Whereas sort of your least severe vulnerability, you know, where you're not even really executing code, you know, you're not really getting a lot of data. It might be a way to get around certain things in a really specific set of conditions in sort of low priority or sandboxed applications. They'll give you $100, which is not a particularly large amount. I wonder at times, given that Google doesn't really publish exactly how much of each of these things they pay out every single quarter. I wonder how many people actually find it worth it to submit vulnerabilities to Google for $100. I imagine there's probably some, but you know, but so we have a general range of ideas of how much you know, the public sector or the private sector is willing to pay for bug bounties, and there's more for certain other things, right? I exclude sort of Google has an outstanding price for about $100,000 for kernel exploits on Android phones. Pixel M is another platform that they have a relatively high cost for for looking at. But if we're looking at sort of your average bug bounties from a large successful company, we're looking in the realm of, you know, a couple $100 to tens of thousands of dollars, maybe $100,000 if we're looking at a particularly juicy bug on a particularly important system that is, you know, survives with persistence and does a variety of other things. So we have a general range. And so let's talk about the black market for a second. The big motivation here is developing exploits, right? There are some resellers on the black market. Whether or not these are particularly significant, it's obviously difficult to tell. Unfortunately, criminals generally don't publish all of their records of sales for me to look at, which is very rude of them. But we end up here where really the predominant reason for purchasing vulnerabilities in the black market is to develop exploits with them. So this is really analogous to many of the traditional economics of crime, right? You know, you don't have legal protections, so you have to price in a lot of additional transaction costs. There's a lot of additional risk. Many criminals have very different sort of risk tolerances and discount rates. And this is different across, you know, types of white collar crime versus blue collar crime. But, you know, in general, you know, a lot of the economics of crime is fairly similar to one another, right? And additionally, there's obviously the sort of Damocles sort of here of eventual legal punishment for selling these vulnerabilities, right? You know, there's some probability that you get caught, and conditional on getting caught, there's some probability of you being sentenced to some crime. But those all sort of fit in your traditional economics of crime. The complications here is that, you know, you have these attribution problems, especially here, in general with cyber, but particularly here, where most of the time what seems to happen is one of two things. You know, one, someone who discovers a vulnerability will write the whole exploit chain themselves, both the vulnerability discovery, the payload, and the distribution mechanism. But frequently what happens is that someone will develop the vulnerability and pass it on to some less sophisticated criminals to actually build the payload and the distribution mechanism, and they will in turn sell that as a package to less sophisticated criminals than themselves to actually go and deploy this. And it can be really difficult to actually figure out who developed a lot of these sorts of things, especially if the developer isn't the one deploying them. So this is difficult, right? You know, it can be very hard to tell who's actually responsible for these things, and as an extent, it's difficult to figure out how criminals might interpret sort of risk and how they price things. And the other thing is that, you know, there are a lot of nefarious state actors out there who are also looking to cause havoc or steal money or steal data or a variety of other things, and figuring out whether or not, you know, someone purchasing a vulnerability in the black market is just some, I don't want to say garden variety criminal, but someone who's strictly out there looking, who's strictly motivated by making money and not getting caught, is different from someone who is you know, purchasing these vulnerabilities to use as part of a complicated series of attacks on infrastructure or other sort of, you know, nefarious state actor uses. But so this is from another RAND report. Well, not another RAND report. This is not a RAND report. This is from a RAND report written by Lily Ablon, who is now at who is running security at Ring. But this is approximately, you know, how much certain people might pay for different types of exploits on the black market, specifically 0 days. These are 0 day just simply means an exploit that hasn't been discovered or used yet, right? Which is to say that we're still at day 0 of this exploit being not patched, well discovered. So we can see here that, you know, the prices for a lot of these are significantly higher than sort of the Google bug bounty program. but obviously we have to, price into a lot of this how likely one is of getting caught, the additional frictions of doing business in the black market, whether or not you're actually going to get paid by other criminals, all sorts of other things are additional costs on this. But you can see that, we're looking at things in ranges from, on the low end, sort of like $500, $4,000 to the high end where we're sort of looking at like $200,000, some really, really hefty prices. And this is from 2007 to 2012. We're talking with inflation here, around $300,000, $350,000 on your top end. And that's, assuming that the market for vulnerabilities hasn't, also respectively grown over time, and that sort of exploits have remained exactly as lucrative as they were in 2007. So we're looking at things that are significantly more lucrative to sell on the black market than they are in sort of in the private sector. And the public sector sort of has a strange dual mandate here, right? And when I say the public sector, specifically I'm talking about various governments, but some aspects of the government, right, really are interested in patching vulnerabilities. They don't want critical infrastructure to be attacked. They don't want their citizens' data to be taken and exploited. They don't want various government data to be taken and exploited. But similarly, at least for the US and also for various other regional powers throughout the world, there is this concept of nobus, which is nobody but us. And this is generally the idea that there are certain exploits that are difficult to use to the point where only a particularly sophisticated group of security professionals with significant computing resources would really be able to exploit these vulnerabilities. And it might be in that case that the government might use those vulnerabilities to execute their own acquisitions of data or destruction of certain types of computing resources, with the idea that nobody but us would be able to use this vulnerability. And whether or not this idea is correct is sort of immaterial, because it seems that there are a number of people that buy into the idea that stockpiling 0 days is a legitimate and useful thing to do for various governments. So you have this sort of dual mandate, well, not dual mandate, but dual motivation for a lot of pricing in the public sector. And sort of, there's a lot of analogous things here, right? Undercover law enforcement, arms control, you might think, but these aren't really particularly good. It's hard to find another field where there's sort of this very opposing dual use. But yeah, I think the real complication here is the trade-off between security and developing exploits, right? Sometimes you can get away with shielding your critical systems in ways that don't use these exploits, and maybe you're interested in that, but it's very difficult. It's hard to discern in many cases. But so before we go on to the next slide, there's actually a middleman that sells to a lot of North American and Western European intelligence agencies a lot of security vulnerabilities. This company is called Zerodonium, and this is their pricing chart for desktops and servers. So we can see that sort of on the low end for Linux and BSD OSs, for relatively low priority sorts of things, there's not a lot of money in it, up to $10,000. But if we're looking at sort of like remote code execution on Chrome or on Windows or on Apache or on Mac OS, we're looking at like $500,000 to $1 million. So we're looking at really, really extensive things. if someone were to hand over one of these vulnerabilities, you know, they would be set for quite a while. So there's a strong motivating factor here, and certainly they're able and willing to outbid much of the black market, and obviously in many cases the private market as well. But we aren't even onto the particularly expensive ones because this is their payouts for mobile. You know, we're looking at like on Android and iOS for full chain with persistence, which is to say that it's a full chain exploit that is able to persist across restarts and file deletions. We're looking at up to like $2.5 million. You know, even less intensive exploits on sort of mobile platforms through like WhatsApp or for mobile messaging, you know, we're looking at up to $1 million, $500,000 for a lot of these sorts of things. Telegram and Signal and Facebook Messenger, you know, remote code execution, you know, we're looking at up to $500,000. So these are really expensive, really by far outbidding basically everyone else for these sort of cream of the crop vulnerabilities. But this begs to the question of well, okay, well, why are they doing this? Well, there's a lot of competition between buyers in these spaces, right? And price is just one of them, right? You know, traditional economics of crime tells us a little bit about how legal punishment can be used as a deterrence. Ease of payment is a big one. Obviously, selling things through the black market is very difficult and time consuming. And oftentimes you don't know whether or not you're getting paid or if you're going to receive the thing that you're paying for. You know, there's without potential legal repercussion, it can be difficult to do it. There's use preference as well. You know, there's plenty of hackers that generally don't like the idea of selling to various governments or intelligence agencies. There's various hackers that don't like the idea of selling things on the black market for nefarious purposes. So maybe that can make up some of the difference between the prices of the Google bug bounty programs and places like the black market or Zerodonium. But that's a good question. How much would that really impact a variety of different people? And I know that I'm running out of time, so I'll try to go a little bit faster. But you know, how do we think of this, right? Traditional auctions are maybe not the worst way of thinking about it, or the best way of thinking about it, right? Most auctions, however, don't really have this idea of the primary benefit of purchasing or of bidding is to exclusively deprive one of the other bidders of whatever you're bidding on, which is really the goal of most private sector entities, right? They're bidding on these vulnerabilities to patch them, which is really the same as just making sure that the other people don't get them. So this can be a little bit different, but it might be very useful to think of this one pricing. And the other one is to think of it sort of as like a bribe or ransom insurance, right? You can prepay to reduce your exposure to certain sorts of things. This gets a little murky when we get into like public sector buyers, right? You know, when you have this sort of dual idea of both developing exploits and protecting against them, that becomes a little complicated. But sort of looking at future investigation, I think I'd like to get a little bit more data on current black market public sector trends for sales, specifically monetary and non-monetary changes, right? I'm sure that we all know that, you know, a lot of you know, what people refer to as the dark web or the deep web, which are different but close enough in this context, you know, has become more prolific in recent years. You know, how has that changed the market, both monetarily and non-monetarily? Sort of identify better frameworks for looking at how this works, test them on whatever data we can get, and sort of think about how we can use that to inform ourselves to better do this, right? You know, if the government is really willing to pay $2.5 million for certain exploits, you know, well, what's the real difference between paying $2.5 million and $2 million? What about $2 million and $1 million? You know, part of the question here is, are we really pricing these sorts of things efficiently, right? Is Google really pricing, you know, certain exploits at $30,000 that other people are pricing at $1 million and expecting people still to turn them over to Google? And that's a complicated question. But that is sort of where it ends. And I'm happy to answer any questions or to talk about things or hear suggestions about things to improve on. So yeah, that is about it for me. Thank you.
All right. Well, if anybody has any questions, you can use that same questions box that you used. Those of you who did answer the bugs question, that you used to ask questions of Bryce. He'll be here the whole time. So if you come up with a question between now and the end of the session, you still have a chance to answer it. And let me.
And thank you, Bryce. This is Karen. That was a great presentation, very interesting. Something that I didn't know anything about, and I don't think it's a typical topic that we typically discuss in ICEAA. So I found it very interesting.
Thank you very much.
All right.
All right, like Megan said, if there are any questions for Bryce, feel free to type them in and we can always get back to them as we go through the program. So moving along with the program, our next speaker will be introduced by Mike Pfeiffer, and Mike is one of our directors at large or board members. That was recently elected back in to start in the January term. So take it away, Mike.
Thanks, Karen. Well, it's my pleasure today to introduce our next speaker. Received a very impressive bio that I kind of want to walk through. Dr. Wali Mondal is a professor of economics and academic program director for economics at National University. He obtained his PhD from The Ohio State University, a master's degree in development economics from Boston University, and a master's and bachelor's degree with honors in economics from Rajshahi University in Bangladesh. Professor Mondal has worked and consulted for many national and international organizations, including the United Nations Development Program, the World Bank, the state of Ohio, and Duke Energy. He has taught in a number of universities in the United States, Bangladesh, and New Zealand. During 1993 to 96, he was the chair of Accounting and Economics and Business Education Department at Henderson State University in Arkansas. He served as the interim dean of the School of Business and Management of National University during 2007 and 2008. Professor Mondal was a Fulbright scholar and was placed at the University of Sfax, Tunisia during January to February 2012. His research areas include economic development, entrepreneurship, and micro-entrepreneurship. And he's published and presented approximately 100 papers at many national and international conferences and journals. In 2002, he published a book titled Microcredit and Micro-Entrepreneurship, a collateral-free loan at work in Bangladesh. In this book, he traced the origin of collateral-free microcredit to Rabindranath Tagore, who is known for his literary talents and was the first Indian citizen to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913. He is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Business and Behavioral Sciences, Journal of Business and Accounting, and Journal of Business and Educational Leadership. He is the founder and president of the American Society of Business and Behavioral Scientists, one of the largest interdisciplinary professional societies. I can't tell you, I'm hoping I can do half as many things as Dr. Mondal has done here. And so it's my pleasure to introduce him today in this presentation on a cost-benefit analysis of fiscal stimulus packages for mitigating COVID-19 pandemic. With that, sir, I will turn it over to you in your presentation.
Thank you very much. First of all, can you all see the screen? And that was a great introduction. First of all, I have to say that I learned a lot about bugs today, and the title was very appropriate. Bugs, bugs, and more bugs. This is big business. and I can probably say a little bit about my topic of the pandemic and kind of addressing it with significant resources. There are lots of bugs in our society at this time. You can relate that to it. Unfortunately, that is the truth. With that, I will stay with my own specialty, which is talking about the fiscal stimulus for mitigating the COVID-19 pandemic. I begin with thanking my good friend, Dara Mustainbillah. He and I talk occasionally, and just recently he asked me if I have something in the burner I would like to present. And this was something that I was working on, and it gave me a great opportunity to come up with something which is, I would not say 100% complete, but getting there. So in a couple of weeks, I want to write this paper and submit it to a journal. That's all we do as academicians. So let's start. And I start with kind of an introduction to the pandemic. It is now more or less known to all of us that it's a global catastrophe, without a doubt. And in the US, we're in the fourth wave of this catastrophe. The last pandemic that happened was more than 100 years ago, and it did not last as long. But looks like we are going to have to fight with this for a longer period of time, and that's for a variety of reasons. And my primary objective in doing this study is to see the effectiveness of the fiscal stimulus. I can go back just a little bit, and many of you know that this idea of fiscal stimulus originated from a great economist called John Maynard Keynes. In our society and in the profession of economics, there's some kind of a division between Keynesian and the supply-siders. The supply-siders are somewhat monetarist, and they want to address everything with monetary policy or leave it alone. But John Maynard Keynes was perhaps one of the greatest economists of all time. In 1936, he published his book called The General Theory. The title of the book is long, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, but it is simply known as The General Theory. And that book actually followed the Great Depression. So he observed what happened in the United States, and then he came up with this idea of government giving a stimulus to various sectors in various forms. And then the concept of multiplier also started at that time. The multiplier is like the ripple effect. You spend $1, it becomes someone else's income. They spend it, it becomes someone else's income, and so on. And like it or not, every president, every administration since Keynes' book was published has tried it, but people still talk against it. So that is kind of a background. So let's see where we are and how much money have we pumped into our economy. In my estimate, roughly about 27% of our GDP, $5.6 trillion. That's roughly about 27% of our GDP. And how is it doing so far? So we were talking about the overview and the objectives. So I can go to the next one. What we know now. So you see that, right? The COVID-19 pandemic, what we know now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So this is actually old knowledge. So I will go fast. We know that it started in China. There is no question about it. The only question is, did it start from the wet market in Wuhan province, or did it start from the lab? But let the debate continue. But it started from China, and either in the lab or in the wet market, whatever it is, time will tell. But the fact is, on March 11 of last year, 2020, a year and a half almost ago, the WHO, the World Health Organization, declared the COVID-19 as a pandemic. And that is when more than 110 countries of the world, more than 110 countries were infected with this COVID virus. So to give you some of the early statistics, and go to the next one. At that time, in March of 2020, we always have 4.2% of world population as of now. But at the time, our share of the COVID-19 was almost 20%. And I have a reason for tracing this, because if we know how bad the situation was, and then we can correlate that, or we can bring that up to the size of the stimulus. So here's a simple, you guys are all accountant, it's a simple arithmetic. If United States had 20% of the share of the COVID-19, then that amount of resources of its GDP should be devoted to addressing it. There was some argument about it, but I think the bigger group of economists won that argument. And there have been some questions about the big stimulus, but as you will see very soon, that of all the things that are being talked about, most of the stimulus was basically provided during Donald Trump's administration until he left, the last one being on December 27. I will come to that. So let's go to the next one here. Now that was the beginning. United States had 20.8% of the world's share of the virus. And at the time, I think even now, the three top countries are United States, India, and Brazil. And in the beginning, there was France and Spain also having significant incidents of COVID-19. What it did was known to all of us. Our economy tanked. Unemployment rate dipped. And at the peak of the COVID-19, the unemployment rate dipped so far that it approximated the unemployment rate of the Great Depression of the 1930s. So the government had to come up with some kind of measures. Now here is something I highlighted. Measured from the fourth quarter of 2019 to the fourth quarter of 2020, the real GDP decreased 2.5% during the period in just 1 year. And the real GDP, of course, is adjusted for the inflation rate. And then the differential impact. What happened was, before the packages were declared, one after another, all the stimulus packages, I will not address the monetary policy, just the fiscal policy. We saw that young workers, mostly women, and people with low educational attainment and part-time workers were mostly affected. And it also affected racial and ethnic groups and minorities, because these are the people who actually live from hand to mouth. They could not work from home. So people like us, we have been fortunate. We worked from home, we collected our paycheck, and we also collected a big part of us, they collected government money, stimulus packages. But in the end, what really happened was that the unfortunate segment of population bear the biggest brunt of the pandemic. And then the first thing that the government came up with was to authorize a vaccination program. it may sound political, but look at this. This vaccination program started from the Republicans, from Donald Trump and his people. And then there were basically very aggressive stimulus packages. And we are thankful for all of the actions that were taken by our government in both regimes, in the past regime and the present regime. And then another thing that I am really appreciative of is the last bullet point here, targeted support for low-income workers. That happened for the big campaign coming from various segments of the population. As I said, both fiscal and monetary policies are fully deployed, but I'm going to address basically the fiscal stimulus. As I said, is $5.6 trillion into US economy, which is roughly about 27%. So the very first one was authorized by President Trump on March 6th, even before the COVID-19 was declared a pandemic. And look here, it was basically for research for a vaccine, aid to state and local governments, a small part of it, and to prevent the spread overship. So research for a vaccine started with the people who are anti-vax today. And then came phase 2 soon thereafter. From March 5 to March 18 is just 13 days. And they came up with another 3.4 billion, very small chunk of money. And those were for school lunches in lieu of school closures, sick leave for companies with less than 500 employees. Some of you may have administered that in your own companies. And $1 billion for unemployment insurance, very modest support. And of course, free COVID-19 test. Stimulus package 3 is the biggest one so far. This is known as CARES Act, Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. And this was signed towards the end of March. It is $2.3 trillion after everything was said and done. It authorized many incentives for various groups of population of our society. A one-time direct cash payment of $1,200, and then a one-time support for each child for $500, additional $600 for unemployment for a big chunk of the population, and $500 billion in government lending to companies affected by the pandemic. And the last point, that $500 basically was targeted for rich people. Then came stimulus package 3. This was the famous PPP, Paycheck Protection Program. It is also known as EIDL, Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. And this was quite a big program, $367 billion. And that was also signed right around the month of April. Out of that $367 billion, the biggest chunk, $130 billion were for hospitals and healthcare providers, and $150 billion in grants to state and local government. So far what we are seeing here is that the approaches that our government took, the Congress deliberated on, were, I would say, very prudent approach. Wherever resources were needed, resources were targeted for those sectors. Then, as soon as that big stimulus package, which was $1.9 trillion, was put into effect, there became a need for more. And This was signed somewhat reluctantly, but it was signed up anyway on April 24, $484 billion. And that is for 24 weeks of business to spend the money if they could not spend at the time. Then allowed businesses that receive PPP loans to delay paying payroll taxes. Remember that last year, our payroll tax and income tax deadline was extended to May. And increased loan maturity of PPP loans to 5 years. So that is stimulus 3.5. We're still on 3. We have 2 more to go. Stimulus package 4. It is known as the relief bill. It is a big package. And that was the last one that Donald Trump signed before he left Washington, D.C. And that was on December 27. It was close to $1 trillion. He was very reluctant to sign it. Some of you may remember that he threatened to veto it and so on and so forth. But in the end, when he looked at the political radar, he saw that it was popular. Then he tossed up something which was actually good for the next regime. He said that he really wants not $600 per person, the third bullet point, but $2,000 per person in direct payment. So he was initially saying that he would veto it, then he came for a $2,000 per person direct payment. And then it was also one that extended the unemployment benefits for 11 more weeks. Now comes the American Rescue Plan. That is the plan that was first taken by this current administration. And by the way, this is the only stimulus package so far that has been passed by Biden administration. And it has $1.3 trillion, the second largest. It's a direct cash payment of $1,400. That's $2,000 that was promised by the previous president, minus $600 that was given. And then there was also a provision for $300 per child. The amount of payment decreased for people with income over $75,000, phasing out completely for individuals with an income of $1,000 per year. So you see a distinct change of emphasis. This package, you can see that it is targeted more. Not that the previous packages were targeted also for low-income people, but this one is targeted more for people I would say low to medium income. You know, if you made anything over 100,000 between the two spouses, you don't get anything. So, stimulus 5, some of the provisions here: increase maximum child tax credit to $2,000, and then it has immediate effect but phases out of support or joint income or head of household. And then it has $300 a week and expanded unemployment insurance through September 6th of this year is coming to an end. $130 billion in funding for K through 12 schools, and then $25 billion for a small business administration to make grants for restaurants and other food and drinking establishments. That last bullet point of this slide has actually, excuse me, has actually paid back in a big way. Restaurants and other food and drinking establishments. That has, I looked at the unemployment data that was released on the 11th of this month, and economists are in agreement that the unemployment rate went down to a low of 3.8%, largely because of restaurants and other food drinking establishments that people started to get. So now, those were, I would say, 5 plus 1, because stimulus 3 was actually 3 and 3.5. So if you combine all of those, that was 27% of was GDP. Before I start this next segment, I need to just regress a little bit. I have not put that in the slide because I sent my slide to Karen Morikas before I got some more data, and that is the inflation rate. I think everyone in this audience is aware that the inflation rate is creeping up. It's going up bit by bit. And that is a big concern to many people, but not to everyone. As far as I'm concerned, it is not a concern at all. Before we start evaluating the stimulus package, think of inflation. In my Principles of Economics class, I tell my students that there are two sources of inflation coming from the two sides of our economy, demand and supply. Demand pull or cost push. The demand pull inflation is what your grandmother told you. Too much money chasing too few goods. And the cost push is coming from either a scarcity of resources that is causing the prices of goods and services to go up, or all of a sudden some kind of natural disaster like this pandemic. So the current rate of inflation that you are looking at is mostly coming from the supply side, not so much from the demand side. If anyone thinks that everyone has too much money to spend, they should think again, because some of us do. Because if you're middle income up to $100,000, you were working mostly from home. At the same time, you collected all these benefits. But think about the big segment of our population, people who are not working. For them, that was the only source of income. So it is not true that this inflation is going to last. And that is what almost every economist in this country agree on. And that's what President Biden was prompted as saying, that no serious economist think, that is his word, no serious economists think that the inflation will be permanent. So then, next question is, if the inflation rate is not going to go up, let's say the tolerable rate in this country is roughly around 6%. If it goes over 6%, then from the past experience, we know there will be serious political repercussions for the current administration. But economists believe that it will probably hover around 3.5% after this Christmas season is over. So then the question is, what have we done with all of these stimulus packages? How is the economy doing? What kind of recovery can we expect? And that's an interesting part, and I'm taking a little bit of time in introducing it, because one of the benefits, and I call it a positive externality of the pandemic for the academia, mostly for the economists, is the various shapes of recovery. Until the pandemic hit us, most economists thought of two types of recovery, either U-shaped, which lasts for a long time, or V-shaped, which does not last for a long time. It comes and goes. So during the recovery, particularly when there were lots of criticism about one of the stimulus packages where $500 billion were earmarked for some kind of businesses, mostly Donald Trump's business, you know, like the kind of business that he had, then people came up with other shapes. And this is just the interesting part of what happened during this pandemic. So the V-shaped recovery is known also as the bounce back recovery. So you'll talk about V, U, K, W, and L, 5 types of recovery. Okay, so if you have a V-shaped recovery, then growth continues at the same rate as before. And this is how it is. You can see the GDP, it dipped and is coming back again. And there is some truth to it. We'll talk about it again toward the end of the other recoveries. Then the U-shaped, and this is the most serious. I mean, I would say this is the most time-consuming recovery for any economy. The economic damage lasts longer, eventually reaching the baseline, and then it starts to go up. So that is more or less like the shape U. It is not as pointed or it is not as sharp as the alphabet V. Then comes the newer invention, the K-shaped, the alphabet K. It happened during the pandemic that wealthier Americans did better than the poorer Americans during the recession. And I already alluded to some of the explanations for it. Main explanation being that the relatively well-off people, educated people like everyone in this audience, myself included, we did well. And therefore, it created some kind of a divide that always existed in this country, but it actually kind of exacerbated that divide between the very wealthy and not so wealthy. So that is this recovery. So look at the prior to COVID-19 and then the recovery. And see the blue line is technology, retail and software, people like you, how you have done. And look at the orange line, which is travel, entertainment, hospitality, and food services. I remember when this article first came out from one of the Nobel laureate economists, it attracted immediate attention of everyone, and that is when the government started thinking about providing relief to those kind of people, travel industry, like airlines, then entertainment and hospitality and food service industries. Then comes the W-shaped recovery. It is also known as a double dip. The economy moves beyond the recession into a period of recovery before falling back and then coming back again. As of now, we really don't have enough evidence of that. Right now, we are going up, up, and up. So that is the W shape. It looks like the alphabet W. And there have been some studies of some sectors. We have 9 major sectors in our economy, and there are, of course, hundreds of subsectors or standard industrial classification C. But only in agriculture do we see that this kind of W-shaped recovery has been happening. It has been coming down, then going up, coming down, going up. And that is, agriculture is a big sector. It also includes poultry and meat packaging and all that. But you cannot just judge the economic recovery by looking at just one sector. So the next one is L-shaped. It's the most pessimistic, the alphabet L. It recovers to a certain degree from a steep downtrend, but growth fails to reach pre-crisis level for years. A period of economic stagnation follows. It happened to a degree during the Great Recession, and that's the L-shaped. And then look at the L here. Then there's another study that came up with this Nike swoosh logo. So it's a non-alphabet. So somebody was probably basically longing for recognition, and they came up and criticized everything that happened during the recession, the pandemic, and they came up with this shape. This is actually not much different from, either V or any other shape that we have talked about. So that's where we are right now. Question is it most pessimistic U or most somewhat pessimistic L, or is it V? It is a little too early to say, but look at this next slide here. So the GDP in Q2 of 2020 dipped almost 1/3, more than 25%. Then it started to go up, and right now the projection is, and you have probably not missed the news, that by the end of the year, our GDP growth rate, that's real growth rate, will be 6% or higher. And that is probably the truth. It is not going to be 6% or higher for the next 2-3 years, but all the projections, it is not my area of expertise. All the projections I have seen point out to a sustained growth of 3 to 4% during the next 4 to 5 years, an inflation rate of no more than 3.5%, could be as low as 2%. I have seen very optimistic and very pessimistic projections of inflation ranging from 2 to 3.5%, and GDP growth rate ranging from 6% to a low of 4%. That's what I had as of now. I will be very happy to take some questions or any comments you may have. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Mondal. Very interesting. And one of the things I found most interesting about it was, you keep hearing about all these stimulus packages, and maybe you actually add them up, but I don't. I just hear about one and then kind of forget about it, then later on hear about another one. So it's interesting to see, how these all add up to, and we're at like about 5.6 trillion total. It's like, wow.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is actually probably the biggest economic lesson of this century. No government. I have looked at all the advanced industrialist countries, and I have also looked at some of the poorer countries. No government has provided a stimulus more than 2% of their GDP. We have provided a stimulus of 27% of our GDP. And that tells me that as a society, we should be optimistic. No matter what goes on in Washington, D.C., when it comes time for action, we have responded. And that is why we are going to get out of it. If somehow we can prevent this fourth wave and not go to the fifth wave, and the government is doing everything possible. Everything is dependent on how the anti-vaxxers behave. But the federal government, this growth, this stimulus package, everything, all of those are dependent variable. The independent variable is the behavior of our population, of our people. So the federal government is doing everything in its toolbox. And the latest one, of course, is addressing some of the concerns of the so-called red states, where the governors are actually working against public health. So and of course, very aggressive campaign of vaccination. Think about it. I talk with my relatives, many of them are in Bangladesh. By the way, Dara Mustanbillah, his relatives are also there. And I talk with friends in other countries like England. Many of my friends are there. I talk with friends in Canada, relatives over there also. They are they are longing for the vaccination. Just a few days ago, a week ago, one of my dear colleagues, who is a professor also at a university in Japan, he got his PhD from the same university as I did. He went back and he got his first shot only last week in the country of Japan. And we are here, our vaccines are being wasted. They are expiring. We are throwing them away. We are sending them to third world countries. We are not taking it. So I say that because when you run a regression, you look at the right-hand variables, the explanatory variables. These stimulus package, this pumping of money, everything is being funneled through those behavior of certain segments of our population. So in the end, I'm optimistic, which is rare for an economist, because I believe we have a great society. Yes, thank you.
All right, Megan, how are we doing on time? Do we have any questions coming in? I know we've got like maybe 5 or 10. I don't know. We
have 7 minutes.
Yeah.
We did get one question for Dr. Mondal, and this came from Steve Sturck. As cost and schedule estimators, what is your recommendation for a productivity factor or realization factor based on the standard 20/80 hours in a year? In other words, what is the percentage for schedule slip due to the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. It's being talked about right now, being debated right now. And talking of productivity, economists always talk about marginal productivity. At the margin, how much are you contributing, and are you being rewarded more than your contribution? To be honest, the answer is yes. There are segments of population in our society who are being contributed more than their productivity. So can we tie this up to their productivity? The answer is going to be a moot point, because this unemployment insurance is going to run out on September 6th, and there likely will be no such thing as any more stimulus package. This omnibus package, the budget, is the only way that government will address the income distribution issue. So in a sense, the answer is that our policymakers have addressed this issue of productivity by coming to a firm decision that there will be no more extension of unemployment insurance from the federal government after September 6th. And that is as we know as of this time. Thank you.
Okay, so since we are getting short on time, why don't we move on? So thank you very much, Dr. Mondal. And again, if folks have more questions, feel free to reach out to Dr. Mondal. I believe your contact information was on the slides.
Yes, so it is on the first slide, right? Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, and so moving on, I think at this point we have Justin. Justin Knowles is also one of our board of directors. He was going to talk a little bit about the results from the spring polling, and then we might have time for 1 or 2 quick questions, quick polling questions after that. So Justin, go ahead.
Before that.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I will make this quick so we can get to our polling questions. That's important for us. We took 2 polls in the spring webinar. One was this one: what topics are of interest in the future webinars? If you look at the top 4, if you include R, the 6th bullet point at the top, it stands out pretty much that tools and data visualization, learning curves, and uncertainty were the top results that people want to see for future webinars. So we are taking that into account as we are planning the upcoming webinars and in-person sessions that we'll be doing. So thank you for that. Next chart. And then this polling question was, which of the CBOC modules would we like to see as part of training going forward? And again, there were 4 of them that jumped out more than any others. Learning curve number 1, And then parametric estimating, regression analysis or learning curves, and software cost estimating were the other three. So again, we are looking at these to determine what learning opportunities and training opportunities that we'll be providing in the SoCal chapter. So give it back to you, Karen, to get some more polling done.
Well, actually, I think Megan has something she would like to say about the training.
Well, yes, and we'll have a slide on this at the end, but the ICEAA Training Summit, which is going to be happening in the third week of September, will be covering every module from CBOC. So it's going to be the first time really ever that official CBOC training has been offered online as opposed to only at our in-person conferences. So those of you who have been on the fence about getting your CCEA, this is going to be a great chance for you to get that kind of training that you'd never be able to get before.
Right, and I would also say that even if you're not looking to become a certified cost estimator, if you have questions about some of these topics, this is great training, especially if you're new to the field. There's a lot of good information. So, all right, well, why don't we go ahead to the next slide, which I think we're going to do a couple of polling. Which means we all need to go to the Poll EV site. And do we know what that is? Yes. So you see at the very top where it says pollev.com/MeganJones104. So if everyone can open up a web browser, you can do this on your phone too, if you're on your computer. And our first question, we really wanted to know if folks were interested in doing an in-person workshop, and typically those are all day, or continue with a 90-minute webinar, virtual webinar. And so there are pros and cons for each one, but the one question to consider for the in-person workshop, even if COVID is not rearing its head, it's calmed down. One thing to consider is, will your companies let you travel? Not necessarily travel, but attend an event that's outside of the company. So keep that in mind as you're answering the two questions.
Well, this is turning into a pickle.
I'm just bringing up the polling website right now. I was a little slow doing that. All right.
Why don't we, we'll keep that question will remain open. So if you guys want to keep filling it out, we won't close it, but in the interest of time, let's move on to the next question.
All right. And so the next question is more of an open-ended question. So again, you did see what topics people had mentioned before they were interested in. Here's a chance to update that, to reinforce, I want to learn more about learning curve, and I want to hear about R, and I want to do, data visualization, or you can add new topics. So this is an open-ended response.
And if you see a response that somebody else put that you also like, you can upvote it. So you also don't have to be creative.
So we have a couple in here. Oh, there's that learning curve again.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And again, you see that the top one there is MBSE. That's because one person bumped it up. So you can vote on these if you see something that someone else has listed here, and let us know. Yeah, that's a really good idea, and bump it up.
Cool. All right, what do you say, Karen?
Yeah, so why don't we move on? And what the board will do is look at these responses and then try to find speakers and topics of interest for our next webinar, which so far looked like was going to be virtual based on your responses, but we'll see, because I think that one's still open. All right, and then on the next slide, right, so this is what Megan was talking about. Here's a plug for the training summit, September 21st to the 23rd. It's 3 days, but it's all recorded. So if you cannot attend those 3 days, you can watch them at other times as long as you sign up for it.
That's
And
right. If you
registration
attend,
fee.
Right. If you attend the summit, sort of like our conference back in May, if you attend the summit, you'll have 6 months to watch all of the videos that'll of the recordings of the sessions that happened during that time.
And I'm going to make a plug because so I work at Boeing, and there is a Boeing person who's doing 2 of the trainings, and that is Denise Nelson. And I believe both of the trainings have to do with software, but I'm not sure. So if you know Denise and want to see her presentations, tune in to the training summit. So moving on, at the bottom of the slide, you'll see the ICEAA OEM COG, and very quickly that stands for Original Equipment Manufacturers Cooperative Opportunities Group. It's a working group of OEM ICEAA practitioners, and we get together and discuss topics primarily from the OEM perspective, but also we see that there are differences depending on what company that you're in or what function you're in, if it's finance or engineering or supply chain. So our next presentation will be October 14th, 9 o'clock Pacific, 12 Eastern, for 60 minutes, so 1 hour. The topic is digital engineering, and so we will define what digital engineering means, and basically we will be showing you several definitions because people have different ideas of what it means. And then we have someone from Boeing who will be speaking about the Boeing's T-7A Red Hawk program, and that is the new trainer for the Air Force, which was designated as the first E program, E meaning actually, I don't know what the E stands for. Something to do with digital engineering. So if you're interested in that, we'll be sending out information, and sign up for it. The more the merrier. And next. Okay, Mike, are you still on?
Still here.
Okay.
I think we wanted to go ahead and just thank our presenters, and recognize Mr. Downing and Dr. Mondal for their presentations today. And we have some coins that we'll be getting your way. And then additionally, I know that we still have a trivia winner that's hanging out there. That Megan, were we able to get some results on that?
In fact, we do, and I've been looking forward to giving them out. We're going to have to give out 3 coins today. Yes, because we got 3 really good answers. The first one came from Brent Larson. His guesses were actual bugs, insects, computer bugs, and particular distinction between virus and bacteria. That gave him bonus points on that one. So first winner, Brent Larson. Second winner being Nathan Hansowitz, who coincidentally is going to be the learning curves instructor at the ICEAA Training Summit. Nathan also guessed bugs, software bugs, sicknesses like stomach bugs, and then very humbly gave himself as an example for bugs as in people who are annoying. So coin number 2 goes to Nathan. And number 3 goes to Steve Sturck, who gave us insects again. Let's see, hold on one moment, because he had a couple of interesting ones here. I lost it. Here we go. insects, software, interstellar bugs, and the Bugs Bunny. So coin number 3 for Steve Sturck.
Okay. So you guys listed some that I wasn't thinking of. I was thinking of like listening devices, or stealthy listening devices. People who are enthusiastic about something, they're a bug. I don't know, a camera bug or something. But yeah, so very interesting, creative responses here. So we will be sending out coins to the trivia winners as well. And with that, does anyone on the panel have anything they would like to add before we sign off?
It sounds like a no to me.
All right. Yeah, well, thanks everyone for attending, and let us know what you will be sending out a survey, and then let us know if you have a topic or if you'd like to present. All right, so and thanks to the board as well, and to our speakers, and to Megan.
Thanks everybody. Have a good afternoon.